If I get a bit ASMR, that's what's going on there. But I think he's gone. Right. So we've got so many different elements. So hello, first of all, thank you for stopping by. If you come in and watch this at any point live, or if you're watching it on the replay, I am joined by Adrian M. Gibson, who is the author of the fantastic Mushroom Blues. Yeah.
There we go.
Wonderful cover, by the way. We were just saying before we get started, I have a train this way. I have a neighbor this way.
Hi, I have fireworks. I have fireworks this way. So
fireworks. So there's going to be a bit of a party around this.
It's Friday. It's Friday night. We're going to have a good time.
Absolutely. Hi, Amateur Reader. Good to see you. Adrian, how about we begin? Rather than me introducing you, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your work? Would that be okay?
Sure, man. Yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, thank you for having me. I know we've been planning this for quite a while, so we had some delays and everything like that, but we finally made it work, which is fantastic. I'm Adrian M. Gibson, author of Mushroom Blues. This is my debut novel, first book in the Hoffman Report series, but also the first book in my broader, what I'm calling the fungal verse, which is my shared fictional universe. And on top of that, I'm also an illustrator, graphic designer, tattoo artist, stay-at-home dad to 2 young boys. And then I'm also the creator and co-host of SFF Addicts podcast, which I host alongside my besties, MJ Kuhn and Greta Kelly. And yeah, basically we interview authors and do like writing master classes and that kind of thing, which is a ton of fun and has helped me a lot along my journey. Maybe we'll talk about it at some point during this interview, but yeah, that's me.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to get into so much of that. Hi, Justin. How's it going? Good to see you. I do want to get to Mushroom Blues, but before we do, I mean, you mentioned that you have 2 young boys, and I am just, as a father to 2 small children myself, mine are 4 and 2. I don't know how you get anything done. I don't know how you get anything done, much less write a book, when you have 2 small boys. How is that even possible?
I just basically, I manage very slowly. Like everything I do is pretty much incremental, because at any point I could be interrupted by screaming, crying, or just like one of my kids like wanting to show me something or wanting to play or something along those lines. So yeah, on like one hand it's like incremental, and on the other it's keeping things not like super rigid structure, but as structured as possible, just to kind of have a game plan every day, more or less, but not being too hard on myself if I don't hit every check mark.
Yeah. I mean, people talk about like the flow state of writing, that you can get into this sort of zone where you can get, I'm like, the zone doesn't exist till like 11 p.m.
No. And honestly, that's something that, you know, if anyone's read something like On Writing by Stephen King, you know, he's very much the kind of writer who's in that mindset of like, you put yourself in this position to write, you get yourself in your like space and whatever, sort of kind of like the ritualization of it, but at the sacrifice of like everything else, you know. And you know, I'm not going to speak for like Stephen King's children or anything like that, but it's like he's also the kind of person who went through addictions and whatnot, and definitely like his desire to write and be so consistent with that like ritual aspect of it probably had a ton of side effects and affected his relationships and whatever else. And so in my case, I'm like, yeah, there are certain things that I can do. Like I can get up early and write before everybody wakes up. I can write in the evening, but there's always the possibility for interruptions. And so Mushroom Blues was kind of like my test case for how do I write a book while also being constantly interrupted by different things. And so I've gotten to a point where I'm a lot more comfortable with, like putting myself into a zone of like trying to write, and writing is probably the hardest thing to do with constant interruptions, but at the same time, not being so just like, I don't know, so like fascistic inside my own household of like, nobody can interrupt me and blah, blah, blah. So it's definitely having a lot of flexibility helps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just important, isn't it? I mean, as much as anything else is wonderful and books are wonderful, like I think you probably agree that kids have to come first. And it's sometimes the issue that we lose sight of that. So yeah, father to father, that was my first, it wasn't going to be my first question, but it's something perpetually just like confused by. It's people who can be productive as you are, with two small children. But it's interesting that you bring up Stephen King, because in Stephen King's book, I don't know if it's on writing, he actually mentions this, but he says that there's one question that he never knows how to get to, or there's one question that always sort of is a no-no for him. And I want to ask you that question. Okay, the question that Stephen King says we shouldn't ask, because Stephen King hates the question, where do you get your ideas? And I understand that, because right, it's a big, broad question. But at the same time, you've written here, I'm looking at the acknowledgements of Mushroom Blues at the end, and your first line is, I'm a weird person, so it was inevitable that I would write a weird book. And I would agree, it is a weird book. When I've recommended Mushroom Blues to a few friends, and they always say, what is it about? And I go, well, it's kind of about a mushroom racist. And then I just let them kind of take it from there.
Yeah. I mean, you could tack on like a murder mystery or police procedural, but definitely like pair it with like a mushroom racist.
But you know what? Mushroom racist always intrigues them. But I guess I would ask that question to you. It's like, where do you get your ideas when a book is as kind of out there as this one?
Dude, but it's such a, like, I agree with Stephen King in that it's like, it is such a nebulous question, in which case, like, he's probably been asked it so many times that he's like, I hate this question. Stop asking me. But in my case, like, I think it's kind of just a fascinating analog to like how creativity works and how we as human beings absorb information and then inside our own brains somehow like decode that information and amalgamate it into something that is representative of us, right? And so I look at my book, and it is an amalgamation of so many different ideas that I've had over the course of my 33 years on this planet. So, you know, it's like blending my love of mushrooms, and I can't say like, oh, this is when I fell in love with mushrooms, or this is when I started becoming interested in mushrooms. It's like, no, it's just a fact of me growing up on the west coast of Canada, and you're familiar with like Vancouver and British Columbia and all like the nature that is there, and mushrooms are just kind of like a present organism within that ecosystem. And you also kind of look at something like Japan, and I can't say like this is the point where I became interested in Japan. It's just something that has been there through osmosis over the course of my life, through the lens of anime and manga and video games, and that morphing into an interest in Japanese history and cuisine and culture and religions and all these different facets. And so that notion of like, where do these ideas come from? It's kind of like, yeah, our brains are just blenders. And the coolest thing about a book is that this is the smoothie that happened to come out of the blender, right? So it's like, we can't pinpoint this is where the idea came from, but at the very least you can appreciate the different influences that you've had over the course of your life that would allow an idea like this to occur in your brain and then take shape in the form of a story.
The mushroom smoothie is quite the image, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, you could have a mushroom smoothie in a sense, or just like blend up some mushrooms and like use it as a base, like a stock for a soup or something like that. But you know, or like the times that I've taken certain types of mushrooms, I did put it in a smoothie to great effect. So
I've got a couple of questions for you in the chat very quickly. Zachary Shea, who's a YouTuber himself, you talked about your influences and the stuff that goes in the blender of your mind. JRPGs, is that one of them?
Very specific time in my life, yes. It was mostly in the 90s when I was growing up, just because of like the consoles that I had. So I had like one of my best friends had a PlayStation, like the original PlayStation, and so we would have like gaming sessions where we would play Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy and stuff like that. But as I got older, it's just like JRPGs just stopped being like something that I went towards, even though I love anime and I love you know, certain JRPG series. But yeah, as I got older, it was more like I started heading more towards like Western RPGs. Like I love RPGs to this day, but it was more so like I veered away from JRPGs and went more into something like Mass Effect or, you know, the different like the BioWare RPGs and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I grew up on those Mass Effect games and Dragon
So
Age
good,
as well.
man.
I think Dragon Age
Dragon Age
games
is
are
fantastic. Actually, like
oh my goodness.
Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2 are the first like I would say Western RPGs that I really fell in love with.
Yeah,
Just because of my love of the Star Wars IP and like that universe.
yeah.
And that was my first introduction to BioWare. And then when it was like, oh, they're making Mass Effect, and I was like all caught up in that hype train, but it totally lived up to it for me in so many ways, especially Mass Effect 2.
Mass Effect 2, the ending, I was screaming at the TV.
Chef's kiss, man. So
Absolutely.
good.
And the way they marketed, for anyone who doesn't know, the way they marketed Mass Effect 2 was you do not know who is going to live or die at the end, because all of your choices are
Yep.
What's the word? Kind of come together at the end, accumulate into this big thing. And there's a section of Mass Effect 2 where your character is jumping to try and escape from a spaceship, and that's the moment your character does or does not live. Now, we now know kind of several years on that it's very difficult to actually get your character killed off in that game. But when you're playing it at the time, you are
No, but it's
stressed.
like it's the fear of the unknown. It's like this is a possibility, and therefore it is a present thought in your mind.
Yeah.
And especially when it comes to video games, you know, and I think this is something that what's the studio From Software has definitely sort of ingrained into its video game like DNA is the notion of death and like losing your progress and whatnot, whether it's like Dark Souls or Demon Souls or Bloodborne and all these different games that they've made. It's just kind of like it's a really effective anxiety that kind of plays into what horror does really well. Just the ways in which it tricks your psychology into being more engaged, despite the fact that something really terrible can happen.
Yes. And I think there's a thing with video games as well. We're talking about all the influences that sort of kind of come together and make us who we are. I think video games are now kind of getting the recognition they deserve as being part of that cocktail, which is wonderful. I've also heard you speak about a couple of kind of literary influence. Before we get into Mushroom Blues itself, some influences on yourself as a reader. I've heard you speak about, I think, Annihilation. Is that right? A book that had a big influence.
Dude, Annihilation is just that is like...
I loved it. I loved it.
I would say that's like, you know, people talk about spirit animal. That's kind of like my spirit book is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. Is just such a phenomenal book, but also the entire series is really amazingly well done. I haven't read book 4 yet, Absolution, but I have it upstairs. It's basically like the next, like, you know, 1 or 2 books in my TBR to get to that one. But Annihilation, that was a game changer for me because I moved to Berlin, and basically like one of the last classes I took in my English literature degree in Vancouver was on post-apocalyptic landscapes. And I'd gone through a bit of a slump when it came to science fiction and fantasy reading, specifically during my time in university. And that class kind of reignited my love for stories within this vein, you know, reading like Philip K. Dick and Margaret Atwood and different like a bunch of amazing authors, but specifically around post-apocalyptic stories. And so when I moved to Berlin, I was like, I want to read more of this stuff. Like I want to, you know, find more and explore my love of these kinds of stories. And I found a bookstore called Otherland in Berlin that was specifically science fiction and fantasy, and went there and told them about these books that I loved, these ones that I'd read, like Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood is one. And when it comes to Philip K. Dick, there's like so many. But they started introducing me to different authors, and one of them was Jeff Vandermeer, another was China Miéville, and the whole sort of new weird literary movement that was really present around like I would say like late 90s, early 2000s was kind of when this movement started kicking off. And back when publishers would actually publish stuff like this, like take a chance on something as strange as like China Miéville's Perdido Street Station or Jeff Vandermeer's City of Saints and Madmen, like these really strange philosophical esoteric stories. And I just went down a deep rabbit hole while I was living in Berlin. And so it's like I was figuring out what I wanted to do. And then I eventually found tattooing and became a tattoo artist. And yeah, I would just spend my time like drawing and tattooing and listening to podcasts and reading. And it was a really beautiful time in my life. And that's when I found these authors who I really cherish. And I found books like Annihilation that taught me the sort of experimental avenues that fiction can go. And Annihilation specifically was the book that made me want to pursue writing more professionally and kind of pushed me in the direction of like, I want to write my own book at some point.
I have Perdido Street Station. I have carried it around with me in this suitcase behind me here, country to country to country, and it's such a brick. But it is a
fat book. I think it's like 700 something pages. Yeah, it's pretty chunky.
And I've read Annihilation, and Annihilation, I always tell people it reads like a bad dream, but the best kind of bad dream. Have you read any Anna Kavan, perchance?
No, I haven't.
Have you heard of the book Ice?
No.
Right, mate. You have to read Ice by Anna Kavan. She wrote it in the 60s. She was this fascinating woman who lived in Myanmar most of her life, and she real kind of drug addiction problems. Heroin, and so she wrote this book called Ice, which obviously can have different layered meanings, but it's kind of a slipstream kind of stream of consciousness book about the end of the world and a man's obsession basically to find his ex-girlfriend, his partner, as ice is just sweeping across the landscape. It fascinating. Really reminds me of Annihilation in terms of that, like, is this happening sort of a thing?
That feels really analogous to Philip K. Dick and a lot of the stuff that he wrote, because he was also on heroin and other drugs during like the 60s and 70s. So that, like, those, like Vandermeer, Mieville, these different new weird authors feel like a modern, like, contemporary extension of the authors who were doing crazy experimental stuff in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, it kind of starts with like the Beat Generation and authors like William S. Burroughs, for instance. I don't know if you've ever read Naked Lunch. No. It is probably like hands down one of the trippiest, weirdest novels I've ever read. But you can see sort of like the progression from the Beat Generation and the Beat poets and novelists into authors like Philip K. Dick and the more counterculture people. And it sounds like Anna Kavan is like definitely within that sort of vein. And I love the ways in which Vandermeer and Mieville kind of took that more experimental nature and kind of like the musings on like what it means to be human and what it means to exist in this universe, and sort of like the more philosophical leanings that I think a lot of science fiction and fantasy has like veered away from, and really dove deep into that. And it's like, yeah, like I appreciate a really fun, fast-paced read, but I also appreciate something that makes me think deeply on the human condition and the psychology of the human mind and our relationship with the world around us and the universe and all these different interconnected aspects of our lives that, you know, science fiction and fantasy can be intelligent in a lot of ways and can explore these very important parts of our lives, but at the same time, within the framework of like, this is really fascinating to read. This is really engaging to read. This is a story that I'm like deeply engrossed in, all at the same time I'm thinking about very abstract ideas.
It's the best kind of story that allows you to kind of ascend to that different level of thinking while also just enjoying the story itself. And I love what you said about interconnectedness, and I think that's a really good segue into Mushroom Blues. Before we do that, I just want to get to a couple of comments really quickly, because you had some questions. Mushroom Blues was awesome. Haven't read the book.
Sorry, Don, about pizza. Apologies.
Shay's asked, are there any series planned in the Fungal verse? Now I know the answer to this, but
I mean, we can talk about that later on for sure.
Yeah, sure. Have you watched the Smurfs?
I was never a Smurfs kid. Like, I just, you know, I was more like Mario and Mushroom Kingdom than I ever was Smurfs. I think it was just a matter of like Smurfs was probably more of like an 80s thing, or at least like if you're an 80s, if you're like born in the 80s and then grew up throughout the 80s and into the 90s. Like I was born in 91, and so Smurfs was just kind of like never on my radar or within my media sphere.
Yeah. And you know what we're going to leave? We're going to leave this one up that just says, I love Adrian.
I love Caden. That's my friend Caden Love. So lots of love going around.
So you talked about the kind of interconnectedness and our interconnectedness with the world. And I thought that was a really good place to kind of launch into Mushroom Blues and talk about the novel itself for a minute, because the setting is really fascinating, and I'll let you do the heavy lifting of kind of responding to this. But the basic premise of the fungal verse, and certainly New Kinoko, the city we're in. I mean, Kinoko in Japanese literally means mushroom. The inhabitants of this city are also kind of deeply interconnected with the city and the stuff that makes up the city, in a way that is very, I don't think I've encountered anything similar in a setting before this. The webbing together of people and place, I think, is really fascinating. And I was wondering, kind of, when you were kind of creating the setting of the fungal verse and Neo Kinoko, what was going through your mind? What was your intentionality behind that?
I mean, a lot of it was thinking about the ways in which the place that we inhabit shapes us. But on the flip side, it's like we shape the environments that we inhabit. And so when I was like constructing the fungal verse, it was originally like, it started out as me reading Finch by Jeff Vandermeer, and then reading the other two novels in the Ambergris trilogy. There's City of Saints and Madmen, which is like a short story, kind of interconnected short story collection. And then Shriek, which is sort of like an epistolary novel with the interactions between a brother and sister within this city. But Finch specifically was like a novel about, it was a detective novel, noir novel, but set in a fantasy city, sort of with a Victorian aesthetic. And there were mushroom people that had risen from the deep and basically recolonizing the land that they had essentially been kicked out of by the humans. And so it was this interesting conversation about like colonization and recolonization. And I thought about it so much that I started to draw mushroom people just as like, tattoo designs and just like random illustrations and stuff like that. And then kept drawing more and more mushroom people and tattooing them on people. And I tattooed one on myself as well. And that fascination with mushroom people, just as like this combination of humans and fungi, really fascinated me to the point where I was like, okay, I actually like want to go further with this and have a dialogue with the world that Jeff Vandermeer created. And in that trilogy, the fungal people they feel more like hive mind sort of societal structure, biological structure. And the individual fungal people, they're called gray caps in that series, didn't have a lot of agency. And so my main critique of it was like, well, what if there were fungal people who had a ton of agency, who were analogous to humans in terms of their ability to live independent lives, to have their own goals and desires and make decisions based on what they want out of their life, but at the same time have that interconnectedness of a biological, mycological network that connects all of them. And so these started to create this foundation for the world and the fungal people that was where the story began. Essentially where the universe began was like fungal people and thinking about their biology, thinking about how they interact with one another. And then that started developing into me illustrating and writing. That's kind of how my world building process works. How they would live, like what their world would be like, what would fungal architecture be like, what would engineering entail, what would their societal structure, their hierarchies, their different forms of communication. They have verbal communication, yes, but they also have what I call the fungal net, which is sort of like empathic communication. And they can emote to each other very much in the ways that pretty much like the best analogy that I can find in the real world is the ways in which we use emojis in technology, whether it's on our phones, whether it's online, messaging apps, whatever. The ability to kind of use this this imagery to convey an idea of, this is my emotional state, this is how I feel about a certain thing, this is what I want to convey to you in terms of like my reaction or my desires or what have you. And so it's not necessarily like telepathy or brain to brain communication in the form of like, I'm going to message, like an exact line of text to you kind of thing. It's more like they're able to read each other's emotions and also shield each other, like block each other from being able to interpret those emotions. So much in the way you can block someone on social media. Yeah. You can also kind of blur your true intentions and your true desires from an individual person if you so choose. And so these are all just really interconnected systems, essentially. The fungal people and how their biology works, and the ability for them through their environment, because their environment is made of mycelium and mushrooms, to essentially send each other chemical signals as a form of communication, but also interact directly with their environment. And so these just really became like fundamental aspects of like how the fungal people function. And it just became more and more fascinating to me to explore the repercussions of like, if X, then Y, and just sort of like flesh out the world from there. And obviously bringing in huge influence from Japan and Japanese culture as sort of a deeper integration of cultural references and religious references and culinary references and societal references and all these different kinds of things to add more depth and complexity and essentially make it more interesting other than like just mushrooms. So yeah, like honestly, it's a really, no pun intended, like deeply rooted sort of set of systems and interactions between like where these ideas started and how they exist in mushroom blues, and the ways in which that just became sort of like the core of the world building for this particular city. And so just for context, it's like Neokanoko is the capital city, but then there's a whole archipelago called Hopon. And that is just one part of a greater world that is sort of like, analogous to Earth, but it's a secondary world, which is inhabited by humans. But Hopon in particular is this very strange, isolated pocket of this planet that essentially developed mushroom people. And so it's going to be interesting for me to explore different parts of Hopon over the course of this series, but also other series within this universe, to give people a broader context of what is this nation like, what are these islands like, and why in relation to the rest of the world did fungal people develop here. And there are times where I'm going to explore other parts of the world that are human. And that will give a good sort of reference point in terms of, here are the humans and this is how their society developed. Here are the fungal people and this is how their society developed. And in the end, it's kind of tackling the question of who is more human, and creating conversations around empathy through the lens of, like you said, a mushroom racist in a mushroom world. So
there's just so many interesting angles to kind of go down there, but I think the one that I always personally get fascinated with, and I think fantasy is absolutely primed for this discussion, is this sort of kind of cultural interaction. Because although I did kind of call Henrietta, the main character name is Henrietta Hoffman, although I did flippantly call her a mushroom racist, I mean, the truth is what's kind of happening. And for her, at the beginning of the story, Neokanoko is basically her prison. Like, she doesn't want to be there. And she is disgusted by the mushroom people and the setting she's surrounded by. Anytime she kind of encounters something vaguely mushroomy, she sort of recoils and takes her mushroom meds. But I do find it very interesting, this idea of building a culture in fantasy, especially one that is unique and not just, kind of orcs, goblins, XYZ. Because I think what an author has to do, and I think this is something you do very admirably, is recognize that there is genuine difference between us and another culture that we're encountering. I mean, it's the same thing in the real world. We have to recognize that although we are equal and we are all the same to some degree, there are cultural quirks and differences
Yep.
that need to be recognized and interrogated. And at the same time, it's like that goes beyond, as you said, that goes beyond stuff like food, clothes. It goes much deeper than that, and you have to kind of, I mean, we both live in different countries from where we were born. You have to kind of recognize all the subtext and the social signals and the sense of humor and the belief system and all that stuff is baked into culture. And I think it's something that you've done very well, is kind of creating this people where it's not just the fact that, you know, they're using chopsticks and things like that. There's a little bit more intentionality behind the mushroom people in the series. I think it's really, really well done.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that was honestly something that I was very, like you said, like the intentionality is basically baked into my process of like, I want there to be a lot of, just based on my own experiences. Like I've lived in Europe, I lived in Berlin for years and traveled around all different parts of Europe. And now I live in Ecuador, and so much of the human experience that, so much of the conflict in human experience is sort of stems from misunderstanding. And a lot of that misunderstanding can be linguistic, it can be cultural, it can be social. And there, like you said, there are these cues. And having visited Japan and just absolutely loving my time there, there are so many peculiarities when it comes to cultural cues and social cues that, coming from North America, are just completely alien, you know. But deep down, the people who live in Japan, the people who live in any part of the world, we have these sort of inherent simple desires that many of us share, you know, to, you know, be able to find a job and be able to support ourselves, to be able to start a family and support our family, to be able to form social bonds and romantic bonds and all these different kinds of things. Like humans, when it comes down to it, we do share a lot of commonality, but on top of that, we have so much sort of, it's like this stratigraphy of culture and language and geography and so many different aspects that shape who we as individuals become, but also who we are as individuals within a broader cultural and societal fabric. And so when it came to like the fungal people and having that distinction between like, okay, here's the humans, here's the fungal people. That's why I was Did I cut out for a second?
You did cut out. I was wondering if it was me. You're right.
Yeah, I'm good. I caught it anyways. I stopped talking. That's why it was so good for me to have that buddy cop police procedural dynamic, because it was like, okay, we have Henriette Hoffman. She's human. She's been exiled to Neokanoko, and therefore she hates this. She hates this place. But it was either like come to like be exiled here or be imprisoned back home, and so she chose this. And like you said, like she's a racist. She's also mycophobic. But these are things where it's like I wanted to explore how culture can program us in so many ways. And I looked at certain times in history, whether it's like, okay, you're living in Germany you're living in Germany during the time of the Nazis, or you're living in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or you're living in America during the Vietnam War, or you're living in America during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and basically the terror wars and everything that happened in the Middle East and elsewhere. There are so many forces at play that can influence how you think and who you become. And it's kind of like you're creating an identity. Okay, like you know, say I'm like an 18-year-old living in the US when 9/11 happens.
Yeah.
My culture, my societal circumstances, my familial circumstances, my community, everything is going to drive me towards the patriotic notion of I want to defend my country, and therefore it's much more likely for me to join the army, so that I can
Yeah.
fight the people who attacked us, right? And so there's these sort of like macro influences that shape how we think. And in the case of Henrietta, she comes from a country where these macro influences are her government and media and different forces that have essentially shaped the thinking of the Cyprianian people, which is a nation of humans, to despise the fungals and justify the war that the Cyprianian government launched against the fungal people. And so the pretext for the novel is that there was a war, there was a spore war for 10 years. And this novel takes place a couple years after the end of it, and kind of like living in the mess and the devastation of a post-war environment. But Henrietta is basically confronted with the fact that like here she is in this city, in this post-war environment, and she has to grapple with the fact that what she is witnessing, especially through the lens of her partner in this murder investigation, Koji Nameko, who is a fungal, she's confronted with things that challenge her preconceived notions in her cultural programming. And so through this experience of this murder investigation, she essentially breaks down her identity. Her identity is chipped away to the point where she goes through a life-changing event that forces her to reconsider who she is and what she truly believes. And so it's really interesting to be able to have these kinds of conversations through fiction, to be able to say like, yes, somebody can be racist, but that doesn't mean they are perpetually racist. Somebody can be predisposed to think a certain way about other people, but there are ways in which they, usually through experience and conversation, can reshape their thinking and their opinions of certain things. So there's like a blues musician in the States. Let me just look up his name real quick. But basically he, through conversations,
I know who you're talking about. Yes. Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
He's Daryl Davis is his name.
Yes.
So Daryl Davis is an African-American blues musician, and he personally is responsible for having converted hundreds of members of the KKK. So how did he do this? He basically sat down with these people who, you know, ideologically through the lens of the KKK should despise him and probably like want him dead, essentially, to be wiped from the earth. But he sits down with them and treats them like human beings, you know, at a bar or whatever, and starts up a conversation. And through conversation, the people who are part of the KKK start to realize like, my ideology doesn't track with my experience with you as an individual, and the conversation that we're able to have and the shared humanity that we have. And so through these conversations is basically like a bridge of empathy that allows these people to understand what I believed was wrong, what I believed doesn't reflect the reality of my experience with this person. And therefore it is possible for me to convert, to move away from those beliefs. And that's so core to the entire story of Mushroom Blues. Even though it is a murder mystery, a police procedural, so much of it is about Henrietta's sort of confrontation with her and her position as a human in relation to fungals, her culture in relation to fungal culture, and the ways in which her experience over the course of this novel kind of breaks down what she believed. And that towards the end sort of allows her to be in a position to rebuild her own truth, essentially.
Yes. Do you know, I find this so fascinating. I've heard you speak about Koji before. So for those who don't know, there's kind of two main characters in this story.
I'll show the cover again, because there's Koji. He's the mushroom-headed beat cop, and then there's Henrietta.
And you know what? I've heard you say, and I've heard a lot of people say, like, "Oh, I adore Koji, and Koji's my guy." And I totally
yeah, I love Koji, man.
I think that's a picture of Koji behind you. Is that right? Am I wrong there?
Yeah, actually, I'll
Yeah.
just like lift this up. So there's Koji right there. That's that sort of like part of my world building process involves like drawing.
Yeah.
So he was actually the first fungal person that I ever drew.
So like I know that so many people quite rightly vibe with Koji and think he's this amazing character, but I also really do have a soft spot for Henrietta. And it's exactly what you were saying. It's that kind of willingness to unlearn and unpick. We talked about everything that goes in the blender that makes you a writer, but there's also a thing of everything that goes in the blender that makes you a person. And unfortunately,
exactly.
a lot of that is nothing we can control, and a lot of it is truly insidious. Like I won't get horribly political right now, but I mean we can think of a million examples where people believe certain things based on where they came from and their upbringing. And so I really did enjoy Henrietta's kind of journey in unstitching what she has made up her own self, because that's painful and it's difficult, especially with some of the other struggles that Henrietta has. But yeah, it was something that I think does really make Mushroom Blues kind of an excellent character study. And again, with that
thank you
sort of cultural element too. And it's so interesting hearing you talk about your travel. I mean, I'm so kind of infamous on my channel about derailing and talking about Japan for half an hour. But I do,
dude. I feel like you and I could just do a live stream on Japan and be able to. we can plan that for the future. We'll just do like a dedicated Japan conversation.
Always down. Yeah, like I think it's interesting hearing you talk about the travel, because travel is one of the main ways for me that I have kind of unstitched how I view the world.
Yeah, me too.
I think we've both been to China. What I thought China was before I went to China, and actually encountering the culture and realizing what it is really like are two radically different things. And it took me going there, and maybe because I'm an idiot, I needed to step foot in there. Maybe people much more able than me didn't need to do that.
No, but that's the thing. It's like don't degrade yourself and call yourself an idiot, because in my experience, like the two greatest empathy builders that exist within the human experience are travel. And that is something that is unique to, I would say, the last 150 years, is the ability for humans to step foot so far outside of their lived experience and basically the experience that they were born into. The ability to say, like, I'm going to fly across the world or what have you. But alongside that, and something that is much more deeply rooted within the human experience, is storytelling. And so it's like, I think I wouldn't necessarily say travel, but more so like I would say journeying in that sense, because look at how humans spread across the world, how we started in Africa and then spread out into Middle East and Asia and Europe, and then crossing over to North America and spreading down into South America. And even now there are so many different anthropological and archaeological explorations and discussions about like how humans actually spread to certain places, because there are certain things that are inexplicable in terms of like how certain people share genetic traits or literal DNA, how certain types of fruits and vegetables and different kinds of vegetation spread around the world. And so it's like, how did X get to Y is a really fascinating conversation, but that kind of gets to the core of like what it means to be human, and humans are an exploratory species. And so for us to be able to literally and physically move to a new place gives us new perspectives on life, and also through stories to imaginatively put ourselves in a new place really ignites our ability to empathize with things that are outside of our I would say ingrained experiences and ingrained perspectives. And so like storytelling and travel and journeying, those are the greatest empathy builders that human beings can go through. Those are the greatest empathy building experiences, because going to a new culture and understanding that, like, even though we don't speak the same language, and even though our cultures are so different, even though we're so far away geographically, there are so many things that we can share. And the amount of places I've gone to around the world where I've been able to literally just communicate with people through body language, is unbelievable, and the ability for us to communicate, even though things take longer. It's like if you're patient with it, you can still communicate with somebody else and have a very beautiful moment and beautiful experience with them, despite the fact that they might not speak your language and you probably don't speak theirs.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like I think it's so important for people to step outside of their comfort zone to, you know, like I have friends who've literally never left North America, and that's totally fine. But I think even within something like North America is so huge that you can just go from one side of Canada to the other, or one side of the United States to the other, and everything in between, and understand that there is so much nuance and there's so much beauty and there's so much magic to how different people are living. You know, it's like if you're in the States and you live on the West Coast, you know, don't just go to the East Coast, also explore everything in between, and you'll understand that when it comes down to it, regardless of political allegiances, regardless of ideologies and all this different kind of stuff, religions that can unite people as much as divide people.
Yes.
If you're able to see how that person lives within their, you know, immediate surroundings and within their culture, you know, even if it's like, you know, you go from California to, I don't know, like Nebraska, you meet someone in Nebraska, you're going to have some shared emotional bond. You're going to have experiences that compare to each other, and you're going to be able to empathize with that person, regardless of the fact of who they voted for or what they believe in, right?
Yes.
That's just like the beauty of the human experience, is that we can share these things. But I think, you know, social media and whatnot kind of exacerbates certain in groups and out groups, and that further distances us from the truth of the matter, which is, you know, the lived experience on the ground and the things that we do share, as opposed to the things that we disagree with each other about.
I mean, it kind of comes back to that interconnectedness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which is kind of one of the heart of what kind of is happening with the mushroom people. So we have interconnectedness. We've talked about kind of the colonialism element of Mushroom Blues, the character of Henrietta. But one thing I think we've not talked about so much is the kind of police procedural, because the novel is a police procedural where they're trying to work out these series of murders and how do we solve this case. And something I was thinking about is like police procedurals strike me as in some ways quite tricky to write, because what you have very similar beats in a police procedural story. You know, you're going to have the autopsy scene, you're going to have the interrogation scene, you're going to have the coming into the dark alley with the guns and swooping around, and a lot of these common elements will make up a police procedural. So I was curious to ask you, how do you make your own stamp on something like a police procedural? How do you tell a story like that and make sure that it's your own unique narrative?
I mean, I personally actually love those commonalities and those beats, and you know, a lot of people kind of dump on tropes a lot of the time, but I actually think tropes are amazing. If it's something that you really love, then that can elevate a story in so many ways. And tropes are tropes because so many people love them, right? That's why they occur so often. And so when it comes to something like a police procedural, murder mystery, noir, kind of like within this umbrella, those beats actually really helped to just give me, I've talked about this in other on other channels and other interviews before, but it's kind of like using those subgenres and their familiarities and their framework as a structural foundation for the story of Mushroom Blues. So it's kind of like blending those different genres together with all the weird stuff that I'm exploring. And so it's kind of like the framework of police procedural and those beats kind of held up the weight of world building and all the weird stuff that I had to kind of like infuse and introduce into the story. And so for me, it's like, I really love the idea of like, okay, there is going to be an interrogation scene. Yes. But despite the fact that, you know, there's going to be an interrogation scene, I'm going to be able to use the expectation of those beats to satisfy you and give you some sort of like foothold within the story that keeps you going forward, but through the lens of the world and the weirdness and like the fungi and all that kind of stuff, be able to surprise you in terms of how I subvert a beat or a trope, or elevate it and enhance it and make it like even more intense, like emotionally intense. And so in like the particular example of an interrogation, it's kind of like, what are the fungal people capable of? And how can I utilize that to, yes, give people an interrogation scene, but also make that interrogation scene stand out in a way that is really like psychedelic and uncomfortable and emotionally traumatic in a sense.
Yes.
At the
Your
same time,
interrogation scene goes places, doesn't it?
it does. At the same time, utilize those kinds of scenes to enhance and sort of build up the relationships, you know, between the characters, or to, yeah, it's a lot of it is just kind of like layering on like the sort of duties of this particular scene. And so it's not just an interrogation scene, it's also an ability for me to develop the relationship between Koji and Henrietta, and give you more insight into how the fungal people work. So there's kind of this mix of like, yes, here's a beat, here's an expectation, but here's all this other stuff that I'm able to layer on top of that.
Yes. Your interrogation scene is exactly the one I was thinking of. I'm glad. I mean, I know we have to keep this spoiler free, but that's the one where I thought there is an element here of a trope, and I completely agree with you that there's nothing wrong. You know, trope isn't a bad word, but then the fantasy is often the kind of the genre blending that's going on here allows you to do something a bit more unique and haunting, frankly, Adrian. I love sometimes the creepiness factor or the uncomfortable factor maybe in Mushroom Blues, and how you're able to sort of use that and kind of integrate that in with the subgenre of the police procedural. It was super enjoyable.
And the body horror as well. That was actually like something that you know, we're talking about like influences earlier, but like Annihilation was for me just like a masterclass in atmosphere and sort of like mood. But also season 1 of True Detective, with Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson was also just like, oh my God, that atmosphere and that show is just phenomenal. And I don't think they matched it. Like, I think they just like went so beyond any expectation in season 1 that they were never able to match it with any other season of True Detective. So it's like, particularly in season 1, it's just like just like the discomfort that you feel and the moments of tension and near horror is so exhilarating. Like that sort of that space between sort of suspense and horror is really interesting sort of zone to play within, and that adds a lot to a story when you're able to up the tension that much just based on how you describe the environment and how you describe the ways in which the characters are navigating it and whatnot.
Yeah. There's again, I'm keeping this spoiler free, but I have to say it just to kind of get off my chest. I mean, there's a torture scene as well. There's a torture scene as well that I think is extremely uncomfortable for very different reasons. But that one is for maybe slightly different purposes. But maybe I'll speak about that later. I guess I'm curious as well. I'm not quite sure the extent to which you outlined, but I often hear authors talk about the fact they finish a book and then they go back to it and they're working on it, revising it, and they realize something is in there that maybe they didn't expect, or there's something that's maybe accentuated that they didn't expect to be as strong in the novel as it comes across. I'm wondering if there's anything like that when you finished the first draft of Mushroom Blues and you went back and you went, oh, that's in there.
Yeah, Henrietta, honestly, like there were so many things. Like there are certain characters in the book that didn't appear until the second draft. Like there's one scene with in like an underground jazz club, for instance, and the jazz singer Rio, she didn't appear until the second draft. But Henrietta in particular, there are certain things where it's like going through that first draft and like reading her and understanding like I didn't intentionally mean to write her as like a narcissistic character, but she 100% is. And it fits so well within like what she's doing and where she came from in terms of like the things that she did in her past that she regrets. And and then coming into how she's interacting with the fungal people in Neo Kanoko, and just like her aversion to them and aversion to the city itself, and all of these things just like tracked where I was just like, yeah, like she is such a narcissist that she did these things in the past and she's here now and she's thinking a certain way. And that really strengthened the journey that she went on over the course of this book, and really solidified my intentionality with how she basically, like, where she ends up, you know, to say like, here's this person who has, you know, and she's still going to be a narcissist going forward, and that's always going to be a source of tension, but at the very least it's kind of like, can you identify the fact that you are a narcissist? And are you willing to, you know, just like the cultural programming thing, like, are you willing to incorporate some changes into your life, or to just have like some clarity and thought about the things that you're doing and why you think that way, is really interesting. But that was something that like became more clear after the first draft and me going through it and realizing like, oh, okay, this is like something that I can lean into more and make it more impactful.
And you know, Imogen Church's narration of Henrietta.
Oh, she's so good, man. She's
so good. I know you said, I think I've heard you say that you would consider doing the audiobook yourself to some capacity.
But I recorded 10 chapters, which is about like a quarter of the book. And then just realized like it's kind of a thing where it's like I will go back and experiment with that. Like, you know, I'm working on a novella right now and the main character is a man, and it's just kind of feels a little bit more within my sort of like realm of capability. But Henrietta in particular is like a very challenging character. And, you know, I felt that I wasn't up to the task of giving her and her story justice through my narration. And so, like I started looking for different narrators and found Imogen actually by listening to the samples of different thriller novels by Ruth Ware, and realizing like she sounds so close to how I imagined Henrietta sounding in my head. That I was like, man, I gotta reach out to her. So I just reached out to her, and then she got back to me like 3 days later, and you know, her response was amazing because it was basically like all caps mushrooms, and she was so excited about it. And she just did a phenomenal job with the narration, that I'm so happy to have worked with her and to be able to continue to work with her as we go through the series. And I got to meet her in person last August as well, which was fantastic. Because I went to Worldcon in Glasgow, and I spent some time in
Sorry to interrupt you. I am Glaswegian, and I did not know that Worldcon was happening until it was like over. And I was in Romania at the time. And I was in Romania at the time, and everyone I deeply, sorry, I'm completely derailing us. Every single person that I deeply admire was posting selfies in Glasgow, and I am like, this is the biggest personal injustice. George R. R. Martin, so we're just chilling with George R. R. Martin, and I'm like, this is an egregious oversight on the world's part, and I do feel a keen sense of injustice. But sorry, you were in Glasgow for Worldcon.
Yeah, so I was in Glasgow and I stopped in London on the way there, and had brunch with Imogen, and then we just hung out for like 5 hours. I tattooed a mushroom on her tricep in commemoration of the book. So it was just a really beautiful experience. Like, we really bonded and got along well. So, you know, for me to be able to say like, she's a really cool person, but she's also super talented, and she did Henrietta justice with that audiobook narration.
I read the book twice, but the first time was via an Audible credit, and so I experienced Imogen Church's narration first, and then I more recently procured the paperback, and so I went through it again, where I did that wee photo shoot on the mountain, and as I was reading the book the second time, it was just Imogen Church's voice just in my head. I'm like, I'm just getting the audiobook, but kind of like in the back of my mind.
Dude, that's so cool. I love
phenomenal, so good.
And then also like my two friends from Sweden who did the soundtrack for Mushroom Blues, and we were able to incorporate that into the audiobook as well, which is a lot of fun.
So your Mushroom Blues has a stellar soundtrack. And the music, the Henrietta's music is based on real fiction. Is that right? Did I pick up on that?
So basically, like in the context of the story, Henrietta, like the technology is kind of like 80s, 90s. So there are like cassette tapes, and basically Henrietta has a collection of cassette tapes that she inherited from her father, who passed away, and that's sort of like a connecting point for her. Like we were talking about this, like cultural influences and social influences and stuff like that. But I think like just on like a family level, the fact that there can be this incredibly impactful signifier for a person, in the sense that like I grew up listening to these cassettes with my dad, and he gave me that collection. And so for her, you know, when things are really difficult, being able to listen to that music and find some sense of peace and calm within the storm that she experiences was really important for me, just to have a bit of an extra an added layer for Henrietta and her personal history, right? And then also all the songs that she listens to are references to friends of mine and books that I love. So if anyone's like looking for like Easter eggs, like just check out the songs that she's listening to, and maybe you'll figure it out, maybe you won't. But it was really cool for me to be able to, like, Nicholas Eames is one of my best friends, and to be able to throw in a reference to him, and he's been such a huge inspiration on me, to throw in a reference to him and his work through these like song titles and bands and stuff like that was super meaningful. And like music is so important to me. Like I used to be a music journalist for years, and that was when I was in university, and then when I first moved to Berlin, and then just decided to like stop doing that because it's a really difficult industry and it pays terribly. So I tried to explore like other ways of utilizing my creativity, but also being able to make money off of it. And it turns out tattooing is much better for that. And so, music is really important to me just on a personal level. So to be able to infuse that into the book as well was really cool. And then work with two of my friends from Sweden on the soundtrack and have that added layer to the entire experience. Just kind of, creating a more multifaceted approach to being able to entertain someone. It's like, yes, here's a book, but also like if you listen to the audiobook, you get so many different elements to it. You can download the soundtrack, you can listen to the Spotify playlist, there's interior artwork, and I put a lot of thought and effort into the design of the book and the way it's laid out. And all of that from my perspective is just like the benefit of being an indie author and being able to self-publish something that goes the extra step, where traditional publishers are trying to save as much money as possible in the production of these books. They ultimately kind of degrade the quality of the end product itself. The story can be amazing, and for the most part they are amazing. The cover is generally the thing that they put the most effort into, but once you open the book, it's pretty cookie cutter and pretty bland. And so for me to be able to enhance the experience with a really visually striking and engaging interior on top of everything, it's just like, every possible point where I could make something more engaging and more interesting and more beautiful, I took that opportunity.
And the art is gorgeous inside as well. But the also the way that you kind of, I mean, obviously the text itself is one thing, and the book is really good, but there's also a sense in which you need to make sure that you're kind of getting it out there and people are seeing it. And the way in which you kind of have done that is really interesting. I mean, I kind of need you to apologize, Adrian, because I saw on Instagram last week that picture of you kind of holding the mushroomed book to your jaw, and talk about what's the word, the unsettling factor. But it seems like you're having good fun, sort of getting the book out the way that you want to get it out there.
I mean, I'm at a point now where I can understand, like, this is getting into like a marketing conversation, where last year I grew mushrooms on a copy of my book, and like physically grew mushrooms. So it's like you can go to my website, adrianmgibson.com, and like on that front page you can just scroll down and there's like an embedded YouTube video. I made like a little mini documentary of it with like a time lapse of like the mushrooms growing out of the book and everything like that. And then I ended it all with like, you know, taking a bite of one of the mushrooms and then eating it. And then that night I basically harvested my my book mushrooms and then cooked it with dinner.
That's
But
so
that
funny.
was just like a one particular instance of like marketing within like the whole grand scheme of things. And when it comes to self-publishing, it's so difficult to get your book out there and just like maintain visibility. I think. And so in my case, I've just experimented with a lot of stuff, whether it's like growing mushrooms on my book, or whether it's partnering with The Broken Binding on different things, and capitalizing on their audience, whether it's like SPFBO, like the self-published fantasy blog off, and other competitions that, you know, really do help to maintain visibility over a longer period of time. And there are people who within the sphere of like the indie community really take it something like that seriously, right? There's also like the book tour that I did, and sort of like 2 months leading up to the launch of Mushroom Blues. And then since I launched Mushroom Blues, like continuing to do stuff like this, interviews and podcasts and live streams and panels and all that kind of stuff. And all of it has just been a constant experiment. But I went too hard into it for too long and basically just like ruined my creative drive for quite a while. And it's like we were talking earlier about the balance of having kids and all this other stuff going on at the same time. You know, I'm also podcasting and releasing new episodes every week.
Yes.
And there are just so many different things going on at the same time. And I went too hard into marketing, which now I look back in hindsight, it's like, it was my first book. And I'm really glad I did that, because it has put me in a spot where I can release new stuff and not have to invest the same amount of time into marketing and visibility.
Yes.
Like I have that benefit now, but I also learned my lesson, and I'm really glad that I learned my lesson with my first book, that I do not have to do that, because I do not want to go forward sacrificing my creative drive, my creative investment in the stories that I'm telling, just to get my book in front of more people's eyes. You know, there has to be a better balance there. But I'm really glad that I am in the position that I am now. You know, like next month, like we were talking about Worldcon, like I'm going to Worldcon in Seattle, and you know, you mentioned George R. Martin. Like we managed to through the podcast, basically, like managed to organize a panel, like a live podcast panel with George R. Martin, Robin Hobb, Brandon Sanderson, Rebecca Roanhorse, and Ryan Cahill. And so it's literally like some of the biggest names in fantasy. And
my hands would be doing this.
Oh man, I'm super nervous, but I'm also extremely excited at the same time. But being able to do things like that, like the podcast, has definitely helped along the way in order to establish me and sort of like my presence and sort of role within the community. So it's like people knew me before I released Mushroom Blues because of my podcast. And now that like Mushroom Blues and the podcast are getting bigger and bigger, I'm able to sort of create like more of like a symbiotic bridge between the two things, between like, here's the books that I'm releasing, here's the podcast, and they're sort of like feeding into each other. And so to be able to do something like so massive at Worldcon next month is just another case of like the podcast getting recognized for everything that we're putting into that, and then that will inevitably feed back into Mushroom Blues and my books and whatnot. And so it's kind of just like, utilizing every possible avenue that you have available to you, basically.
Absolutely. And I saw that you passed 500 Goodreads reviews as well as 500. Just continuous positivity. But this seems like a good opportunity to maybe to link back to the question we had right at the beginning, which was, what are your plans as you are now developing your fungal verse? What kind of writing projects are you doing now?
Who was it that was asking that? Someone in the comments was asking that.
Yeah.
Zachary Shea. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, look out next Tuesday I have an announcement on Daniel Green's channel next Tuesday. So he does like fantasy news every week. So there's going to be like a little announcement during his upcoming fantasy news about something that I've got coming up within the Fungalverse. And yeah, I basically I have Mushroom Blues is part of the Hoffman Report series, and so I have 4 books planned for that, like 4 novels, but also like novellas that take place within the context and like featuring characters in that series. And then yeah, my plan is basically to like keep going with the Hoffman Report, and then after that I'm going to start exploring different series and basically like timelines within the Fungalverse. So it's like jump back a couple hundred years and write like a more like magical sort of fantastical fungal samurai epic. And then like jump forward a few decades and get more into like cyberpunk and sort of like corporate espionage and things like that, like talking about corporations and tech and how that all infuses into fungi. And the Spore War was such a huge sort of backdrop for Mushroom Blue, so like go back and write a Spore War standalone, or maybe like something a little bit bigger than that. So there's definitely a lot of different avenues that I've got in my mind about where I want to go and which parts of the world I want to explore and when. So that's kind of like the beauty of a shared universe is you can, obviously it's like you have to restrict yourself in certain ways in order to like not solidify a certain piece of canon.
Yes.
But at the same time, being able to like jump around to different time periods helps in terms of like, okay, if I have the sort of essentials of like how the fungal people work, I can apply that to any time zone, any time frame, basically, and it won't conflict with what I've already established. And so being able to do that is for me really liberating, to be like, cool, like I love fantasy, I love samurai, I love samurai films and samurai video games. It's basically just like imagine like fungal Ghost of Tsushima or something like that, and that's kind of like what I want to do with that samurai sort of epic. Or imagine like Deus Ex or Neuromancer, or like real cyberpunk, but just bringing in fungi and getting deep into like things like biotech and whatnot in Spore City, which is the first book in that series. So yeah, lots of different stuff in the works and kind of ideas.
I'm currently looking at my copy of Shogun, which I haven't read, and I need to tell you that if your samurai fungal story is shorter than Shogun, I'm gonna be mad at you.
It's a duology, so I'm imagining like 2 reasonably fat books just to go hand in hand.
Mushroom Samurai sounds like such. Oh yes, please.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
So listen, I think that's probably a good point. I know we're way past our hour. We have successfully navigated a conversation where I have not gone off the rails and talked about Japan for 45 minutes. We have successfully navigated a conversation where as soon as you said journalism, music journalism, I wanted to jump in and attack you with my love of Tom Waits. Didn't do that either. So we're doing very well. But Adrian,
so much restraint today. I appreciate it.
You have no idea. But thank you for your time. Just very quickly before we go, where can people find you?
So you can find me. I mentioned my website, adrianmgibson.com. You can get merch and stuff there. I also have tattoo designs if you want to basically buy a tattoo design and like you buy the rights to it, and you can take it to your local tattoo artist and get that tattooed on you. And then you can find me basically on like any social media platform at Adrian M. Gibson. I'm mostly active on Instagram. I think that's more my vibe. The other ones are more just kind of like promotional and cross-posting and stuff like that. And then you can pick up Mushroom Blues. That's the back. So I'll show you the front. You can pick up Mushroom Blues, basically anywhere. It's like Amazon is the easiest place to find it. You can get it in paperback, hardcover, audiobook, and ebook. But also, it's like if you want to support your local indie bookstore, you can just go to them and then ask them to search Mushroom Blues, and then they can order it directly into the store. You can also do that with like big box chains like Barnes and Noble, or what are the ones in the UK? Waterstones, things like that. Yeah. So yeah, you can also check out my podcast, SFF Addicts. Yeah, just on any podcast platform, Apple Podcasts, Spotify and video, also YouTube and video. Just search SFF Addicts, and you can, check out all the cool stuff that we're doing over there. And if you're at Worldcon in Seattle next month, then come check us out. We got a bunch of cool stuff. We're doing a podcasting workshop, me and my co-hosts, and then each of us are moderating or participating as panelists on different panels. And then we're doing that big live podcast with George and Brandon and Robin and all them, which if you can't make it to Worldcon, you can watch it afterwards. I think in like early September, we're going to release it on our YouTube channel and podcast feed. And then Brandon Sanderson's also going to release it on his YouTube channel. So if you can't make it, don't worry, you can actually check it out a few weeks later.
Excellent. Well, I would just want to reiterate as well, the physical book, like there's art in here. It really is a thing of beauty. So I would recommend the physical copy or the audiobook if that's your style. But Adrian, thank you again for coming on, and thank you everyone for hanging out in the chat, and thank you if you're watching this later. Okay, thank you guys. Goodbye.
Bye.